Well, how's everybody? Everybody having a good conference so far? All right, excellent. So let me introduce you to somebody. This is a hero of mine. His name was Studs Terkel. He was an author and a historian, and there was a famous quote of his that says, "People are hungry for stories. They're part of our very being." And we'll get back to Studs here in just a minute, but right now I'd like for everybody, if you would please, everybody stand up right where you are. If you can't stand, then just raise your hand up, okay? Now, if you were born in the year 1973 or before, go ahead and take a seat. All right, it's a few. All right. If you were born in the year 1978 or before, take a seat. All right. 1983 or before, have a seat. 1988 or before, take a seat. Okay. So, those of you who are still standing or have your hands up, the rest of this quote says that storytelling is a form of history and of immortality too. And it goes from one generation to another. And I like to think of the people who are still standing as kind of a new generation of people who are going to be using Selenium and working in our industry and making great things happen. And what I would like to do is kind of help tell my story a little bit, and hopefully you can get something out of it. Okay, you can go ahead and sit down now. Thanks, guys. Oh, but those of you who just sat down, after we're all done here, come up to the stage. I'd love to get a photo with all of you, with the next gen of folks. That would be great for me. That would be a big ego boost for me, so I'd appreciate that. So, Studs Terkel wrote a book called The Good War. And it was an oral history of World War II. People telling what happened in that period of time in their own words. And it's in telling of the stories that we can learn and gain insights to what has come before and what we can do afterwards. So, in honor of this, I've titled this talk, The Good Software Project. And primarily, this is going to be a story, or a series of stories, if you like. It's one that spans over 25 years in the software industry, and it deals with ego and history, and yeah, even software too. And but it's a personal story because it's my story. It's my story. I lived it. And hopefully, I'll be able to share some insights that I've learned along the way that you can take back about being an agent of change in creating software. Okay? So without further ado, let's begin our story. Billions and billions of years... Wait, no, sorry. That's a little too wide angle. Had a Carl Sagan moment there. Back in the mid-1970s, when I was a wee... no, that's still a little too wide focus. We don't need to go that far back. I guess the right place to start this story is in 1992. 1992, I had just been out of, I just graduated from university, graduated from Georgia Tech, go Jackets. And I began working at Microsoft. I have some old colleagues who I haven't seen in 20 years here today, which is really fantastic. I'm loving, it's like old home week here. I started in product support. So if you had a problem with a Microsoft product, and you called the product support line, I might have been one of the people that you got. And I started in supporting, when I started in support, I started supporting Windows. And I was on one of the first teams that supported Windows for Workgroups when it came out. And that went along for a while. In November of 1992, Microsoft released a product called Microsoft Access, version 1.0. And Microsoft Access 1.0, they sold it for an introductory price of $99. Now, even back then, if you were going to get a Microsoft product for $99, you went out and got it because it wasn't going to stay that price for very long. And so a lot of people bought it. A lot of people bought Access just because of the price. And then they got it home or to their office and installed it and tried to figure out what the heck to do with it. Because it was a database product, and databases are not necessarily easy things to know. There's a whole branches of computer science that deal with nothing but relational databases. So naturally, the phone lines were swamped, so I moved over to supporting Microsoft Access. I'd had some database classes at university, and so I got to be pretty good at talking about Microsoft Access and databases. And I supported 1.0 and 1.1 and 2.0. And then in 1994, I applied for a job with the product team as a software tester to be testing Microsoft Access. And I got the job, moved out to Seattle, moved out to Redmond, Washington. And the thing you have to understand about the Access product at the time was that it was, at the time when it was first created, it lived in the same division, the same software division, the same group that produced Visual Studio or Visual C++ and Visual Basic and all the programming languages. This was a developer tools division. And because of that provenance and because of, it was intended to be a developer tools division, developer tools product, the Access test team tended to automate everything. They tried to automate every possible thing that they could in terms of doing testing. And we did that automated testing using Visual Basic. Visual Basic 3, as a matter of fact. This wasn't VBA, this was Visual Basic, right? And eventually we moved on to Visual Basic 4 and 5 and so on. But many of the concepts that were pioneered by that team went on to take root and take hold in Microsoft Test, which became Visual Test, which became Rational Visual Test, and lost track of it after that. Now, in 1995, there was this little operating system called Windows 95 that got released. And it was a big deal. And concurrent with that, Microsoft released a product called the Plus Pack for Windows 95, Plus Expansion Pack. And that expansion pack included Internet Explorer 1.0. And so it was kind of the first web browser that Microsoft produced. And it was kind of cool because you could do things like use COM automation to automate it from VB. And that became important in 2000 because there was, in the intervening years, a memo that came down that said pretty much all products needed to find a way to become internet-enabled or to add features for the internet. And in Access 2000, that feature took the form of something called data access pages. Now, one of Access's strengths over the years was its forms and reports. You could graphically design nice-looking forms and reports to get data into and out of your database. And data access pages were a nice graphical way to design HTML pages that could do the same. You could host them on your intranet, or even, if you were really careful, host them on the internet, which some brave, foolish people tried to do. Now, that wasn't one of my features, but we did use the COM interfaces of Internet Explorer to do the automated testing of that in the Access 2000 cycle. My features for that cycle included a form of the Microsoft Access project file that didn't use the local file-based database engine, the JET database engine. It used SQL Server directly, and it would call directly to SQL Server and would let you manipulate the tables and the views, all the server-side database objects from within nice graphical editors in Access, and still use the forms and reports that you were used to. The designers for those were what I had to test, and the designers for those were not written by the Access team. They were written by the SQL Server team because they already had already built them and made them componentized so that we could integrate them into Access, so you could design a view or design a stored procedure or whatever. Except that their testing hooks were really hard to use. they were native code, right? And we used Visual Basic. And I don't know if you've ever tried to call native code from Visual Basic, but if you get one little thing wrong, you're going to crash things, and it's not pretty. So I knew that they had to have some way of testing these things. They were obviously had these test hooks that they were using, but I just couldn't get them to work right. And I needed to figure out what to do. And I reached out to the team that owned those designers and got a meeting with their test lead about how they did their testing. Now, I could have taken this one of several different ways. I could have filed a bug in their bug database and said, your test tools are crap because I can't use them. I could have said, your documentation is crap because it doesn't exist, and I don't respect that. Or I could have said, your code is obviously horrible because it doesn't do what I expect it to do the minute I try to use it. But I didn't do any of those things. Instead, what I came to that meeting and kind of just sat down with, his name was Adam. I said, Adam, help me understand what I'm doing wrong, and help me understand what my approach should be. How do you use these things so that I can maybe make the same choices and use them away? And this was kind of where I learned my first real lesson about being an effective agent of change in creating software. And that's that being an effective agent of change in creating software requires respectful two-way communication. Not just yelling at the person who didn't do what they wanted you to do, and not just sitting there expecting them to info dump. It requires a give and take. What am I trying to do? How can you help me do this? How can I help you do the things that you need to do? And I've always tried to remember that communication is an important thing. Let's fast forward a little bit to 2004. I left Microsoft for a small independent software company. Well, it wasn't independent at the time. It was a division of Intuit at the time that was based in Tampa. It was spun off within the first year I was there. It was spun off into a company, its own separate company called Numara Software was the name of the company that it became. I think now it's been reacquired by BMC Software or something like that. Anyway, and one of the reason that they hired me was because of my expertise in doing test automation, UI-based test automation specifically, because they had a client-server application. And what I mean by that is very few applications are actually designed this way today, but you had a client executable, a client application that you installed on your local machine, and it would connect up to a server database that had all the data and everything and did some back-end processing on it, and you would do this. So my job, one of my jobs, was to initiate and jumpstart the automation effort for this application. And we did it. You know, it was a .NET shop. We created this keyword-based framework with a whole editor because we really wanted our non-coders to be able to write test cases as well and have automated tests, and we did a pretty good job of creating an automation system for this product. But, well, I say it was successful. It was successful in one sense because we got the automation done. It was completely unsuccessful because, well, it was a keyword-based framework, and I'll be happy to tell you the story of why that's an epic fail if you come and see me afterwards. That was, you know, there were reasons for that. But after we got most of the testing, the automated test cases for the client application, there was another piece to this app that was a web portal, okay, that that you could use. It was simplified, right? So if a technician wasn't at their desk with the full client app installed, they could bring it up on a user's machine that they were going and looking at their computer and get data out or type a little quick note into the record in their database. And we were manually testing that, but since we had gotten to a point of fairly full automation on the client app, we decided, okay, well now it's time to tackle this web portal. And we started looking around for how are we going to do this? How are we going to integrate? What tool were we going to use? And how are we going to integrate it with our existing test framework? This was 2006, 2007 when we were actually looking at this. And we evaluated Selenium at the time, which was Selenium RC at the time. The Webdriver really didn't exist yet, at least not in any public consumable form. And we looked at that, and there were two things that stuck out about Selenium RC to us. One was that the API was horrific. We looked at it and we said, okay, let me get this straight. There's this one interface that has 150 methods on it. Ew. No, we're not going to do that. The other thing was that it was it required a Java, server and the Java runtime, and we were a .NET shop, so you're like, no, we're not going to spin up a whole Java runtime just to do our testing. We also evaluated Water at the time, web application testing in Ruby. Does anybody here use Water? Yeah? Yeah? A handful? It's fun to talk about Water here in Austin because Brett Petticord, who invented Water, lives here, and he's a cool dude. But again, we had no Ruby expertise in house, right? So we talked about it. We said, well, what if we run into problems? Are we going to have any, what kind of support can we get from the development team? And well, none, because no Ruby. And so we said, well, maybe that's not one. We did like the Water API, though. Boy, did we like that API. Boy, was it smooth. It really sat with us, and we really liked. It fit in with the way that we saw, web pages. So we started looking around for alternatives, and at the time there were a lot of different ports of Water. There was one called Wattage, which was a Java port, WATIJ, web application testing in Java, and there was also one called Watin, web application testing in .NET. And we're like, okay, well this has an API that we like, and it's written in a language that we know, so hey, why don't we go ahead and use that? That sounds like a pretty good idea. So we started using Watin. Watin was primarily an IE automation library, primarily, because it used the COM interfaces to drive IE. But it also had some cross-browser capabilities. It could drive Firefox as well. And so we felt, while IE was our primary use case, because, well, it's 2006, 2007, IE6 is the coin of the realm, right? Nobody was using anything but IE6, especially not enterprises, and nobody was running any operating system other than Windows XP, because it's 2006 and it's everywhere, right? So we felt pretty good about this choice. And so we started using it, and time marches on, and then Microsoft started to update things. And they started to update things that were really good for consumers, right? Specifically on a security basis, but because they made computing more secure. But for people who had to do automation like me, that was kind of a bad idea. Internet Explorer 7 came out in October 2006, and that had a wrinkle in it that you could no longer, it was multi-process Internet Explorer, so you couldn't count on one browser window being one process on the machine anymore. So that threw a wrinkle into the works. It also introduced protected mode zones. And then Vista, Windows Vista, was released in January of 2007, which introduced user access control. And all of a sudden, you couldn't easily be an administrator on the machine, even if you were an administrator account. You had to elevate those privileges in order to do anything. Now, we solved this problem really easily. We ignored it. We were able to ignore the Vista problem for a bit because, well, nobody used it. Businesses didn't upgrade to it readily. Some did, but the vast majority stayed on Windows XP because that was what they knew, and IT departments, I don't know if anybody's ever worked at a big corporation with a big corporate IT department, but they don't like changing things. So XP was still pretty dominant, so we were able to avoid the Vista thing for a while. And the IE7 thing we could kind of ignore because we could still get the testing done on Windows XP because you could put IE7 on Windows XP, so that was fine. So at this point, let's recap. We had a system for testing IE and Firefox, but mostly IE because that's really what we worried about. And on XP, but we were ignoring Vista, okay? Side note, Google Chrome was first released in 2008, which we also promptly ignored because nobody in the business world was actually using it. I mean, developers used it because it was fast, but you know, businesses didn't use it. Watin didn't have a story for Chrome automation yet, but again, since we were ignoring it, we didn't care. And then in 2010, Mozilla released Firefox 4.0, which is great, except that it entirely broke the way that Watin used to automate Firefox. Crap. Well, now we have to figure something else out because we can't go without testing Firefox. You know, we just started getting Firefox testings, for Pete's sake. We can't just throw all that away, and Firefox 4 just didn't work anymore. So now we had to start looking around for more alternatives again. And ain't that always the way? So the Webdriver project merged with the Selenium project, and this Webdriver, of course, it started in 2008 by Simon Stewart, and it started to gain some steam and some momentum, and it merged in 2009. When the Webdriver project merged with the Selenium project, there was a very skeletal piece of .NET language bindings. They were not complete. They did not work against any browser. But the skeleton was there. I mean, the project was created. You know, the Visual Studio project was created, so surely something had to be, you know, something was there. But we saw the potential, right? We saw that, okay, here's a library that, in theory, can give us the cross-browser piece that we need. And since we were already invested in the Watin API, I also started looking around, and I said, and I noticed that there was this little project called Water Webdriver, okay? And I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this project, but it has become the Water project now. But it was the Water API, but underneath, to do the actual browser driving, it used Webdriver. And I was like, well, okay. That's pretty much exactly what we want to do. We want to stay with this API, but we want to use a different technology underneath. And I said, okay, how hard could it be? Well, I mean, okay, so because Water Webdriver was written basically by one guy. Jari Bakken is his name. And I said, so how hard could it be? You know, we get language bindings, we can make it work for the Watin API. And that was before I met Jari and knew that he was a frickin' machine at coding and probably one of the best developers I've ever met. So, in my ignorance of how difficult a project it might be, I decided that we create the .NET bindings for Webdriver. We can do that, then we'll go and we'll make Watin Webdriver and we'll be fine. We'll have our cross-browser platform or story and we won't have to change our code, right? We'll have the same API. Well, so that was the 2 steps. I did the first step, which is creating the .NET language bindings, and I never got around to the second step. Still waiting to try to figure that out, but it's never going to happen now, I don't think. The next part of the story is after I had kind of gone through the process of getting involved in the Webdriver project and had done the .NET bindings and had gotten the ability to commit to the project, I started, in those days, the language bindings were much more tightly coupled to each individual browser implementation. And so it was, the mechanism that you use to drive each browser was slightly different. And I noticed that as I created the Internet Explorer piece for the .NET bindings, right? So that I had the Internet Explorer driver, and I started running the tests, because we had tests, because we copied a lot of them from Java, or ported them, I should say. And I started to notice that I could start the test suite and start to run it all the way through, and just run all the tests. And I would notice that as it would start, and then it would start out fine, and then it would start to slow down a little bit. And then it would start to get a little slower. Then it would start to get a little slower, and then eventually you'd start to see tap, tap, tap for send keys and character at a time. And I'm thinking, well, that's suboptimal. And I knew that the Internet Explorer piece had been written by Simon, right? The father of Webdriver, right? He told the story about how does it compile. You heard that this morning. So, and remember, I'm not a C developer or a C++ developer, at least not at this time. So I figured out a way. I figured, okay, well, I've got to figure out what's going on with this bug, because, I have the Microsoft tool chain. Surely I can figure out what's going on. And I started to look, and lo and behold, as I got in and started debugging it, there was a buffer that was being allocated every time through a loop, and it was never getting freed. Classic memory leak, right? So we were chewing up all the memory on the machine, and eventually, you had no memory left. But this was not in my code, right? This was in Simon's code, and Simon's a pretty intimidating guy, right? I don't know if you guys know this. I mean, he's a teddy bear, right, in person. But when your only experience with him is as the architect of this really amazing piece of software, and all you've ever done is chat with him on the IRC channel and over email, it's pretty intimidating. So I can't remember if I did this over email or if I did it in IRC. I kind of said, Simon, I think maybe there might be a slight bug in the IE driver, and I think it might be like this. I think you might be having a memory leak, and I think it might be here. Now, I could be wrong. I could totally be wrong, and if I am, please accept my apologies. But I think maybe you got a bug there. And Simon, being the gracious guy that he says, yep, that's a bug. So he fixed it. And that was my first experience with the IE driver. But concurrently with this, as we were starting to do this, there started to be this movement toward standardizing on the JSON over HTTP protocol that we're all familiar with today, is how browsers communicate with the language bindings. And then suddenly Microsoft released Windows 7, and everybody upgraded to Windows 7. Well, now all of that ignoring that we'd done of you can't elevate, you have to of elevation and all that stuff, well, we couldn't ignore it anymore because our customers were using it now. Crap. Now we have to fix it. So that was the other problem with the IE driver, is on Vista against Windows 7, you had to elevate your permissions. You had to run from an administrator prompt, right? And that's not a great user experience because you can't automate that dialogue. You can't have the computer just accept and say, yes, I want to run as an administrator. It's a blocking dialogue. So in August of 2010, I decided, how hard could it be? Let's rewrite the IE driver so it doesn't have to do that. And this was August. I started on it, and I landed, the driver landed in 2010 in December. And the second key takeaway about being an effective agent of change in developing software is that it requires participation. Don't wait for the invitation. Just jump right in and do it, right? We have a saying in the Selenium project, code wins. Decisions are made by those who show up, and the code that gets put in there is the code that if it works, then that's going to be the decision that gets made. So the first Selenium conference was in 2011 in San Francisco. And at that conference, there was a trend that was very clearly noted there. And that trend was toward browser vendor supplied drivers, because at that conference, Opera Software debuted an Opera driver that they maintained and they built, and that was a revelation. That was like, whoa, you mean we don't have to write that? We can test Opera and we don't have to worry about how do we communicate it because they already know that? Cool. And also at the same conference, the Chromium team stepped up and said, oh, by the way, here's Chrome Driver 2.0, and guess what? We're building it, and we're going to maintain it, and we're going to own it. Oh, you mean we don't have to worry about how to automate Chrome anymore? Fantastic. This is amazing. So there started to be this trend toward the browser vendor themselves owning the implementation. And so I wrote this blog post. It's the very first blog post that I ever wrote. That tried to answer some of the critics of the IE driver, because there are some limitations of it, some behavior differences that are a little annoying and quirky because of limitations in the browser itself, not just because I'm incompetent, though I am. And in the last paragraph of this blog post, I said, I challenge Microsoft to step up and provide us with an implementation that drives IE. I mean, I figured, it's just a little project, it's a little open source project. Nobody's going to listen to some guy, who's just randomly ranting on the internet. I joined Salesforce in 2012. Salesforce had a huge investment in Selenium Selenium tests before I got there. They had, over the years, we invested millions and millions of dollars in infrastructure to run data centers and virtual machines for automation. Let me do a quick info dump of some statistics of where we are now, because that's where I am now. We have over 1,000 plus commits a day to our source code repository internally. We have over 450 software engineering teams all working on the same repository. We have 100,000 unique Selenium tests, or Selenium tests, and 80,000 of those are Webdriver tests. We run them against Internet Explorer, against Firefox, against Chrome, against Safari, and soon against Microsoft Edge. The remaining tests that are Selenium tests are Selenium RC. We are actively converting those. We have a plan in place. It's going to get done this year, come hell or high water, by Christmas. So with Salesforce's support, I kind of reached out using some contacts at Microsoft and said, hey, what kind of help can you give us with this IE thing? A surprising event of some of this reaching out was that the Visual Studio team actually started using the .NET bindings from Selenium as its cross-browser support mechanism for coded UI tests, the testing technology inside Visual Studio. If you wanted to run cross-browser, you used the Selenium.NET bindings, which was really kind of a cool thing, unexpected, but cool. And Simon talked a little bit this morning, and you've heard about it all day, the World Wide Web Consortium. And so I'm not going to go into what that is, what the W3C is, and what the working group is about the spec. But the spec was started, and this is a photo of one of the working group face-to-faces as we're having dinner on a sidewalk in London. Now, at least one of the people in this photo doesn't care for the photo, so let me give you a more recent photo of the working group, also at a meal. But as a W3C member, and as a working group member, Microsoft kind of participated in the crafting of that spec. And they sent representatives to John Jansen, who is actually here this week. He works for Microsoft, and he was part of the working group, part of helping to bring the spec into reality. And back and forth, face-to-face sessions, back and forth emails and chat rooms, and eventually, Microsoft did release an alpha version of an Internet Explorer driver. I don't know if anybody actually knew that, but it was released as a COM object that you could then, instantiate and send JSON commands to and get back, and it would automate the browser. Not very well, because it was alpha level, right? There was a lot of functionality that they didn't get done. And But we integrated it into the IE driver that the open source project provides as an option. You could use either the open source implementation or the Microsoft implementation. Now, this was not a spec compliant implementation at all. Again, this is just alpha level. And then in 2016, Microsoft released Windows 10 and Edge, and they decided, ooh, so now we forked a browser. What do we do about Internet Explorer? And they made a trade-off decision, right? There's only so many development hours to go around in a given day or a given product cycle. And they had to make some choices between either continuing to invest in Internet Explorer, which is an older browser and has a lot of legacy things in it, or to cut their losses with that and just move forward and concentrate on Edge. And that's the right decision for them. Concentrate on Edge. One of the reasons it's an okay decision for them, and I had a chat with one of the program managers on that team that the web platform team, and they said, well, we're abandoning our implementation for Internet Explorer. We're just not going to work on it anymore. And really, honestly, the reason that we feel okay about doing that is because, see, there's this open source version, and it works pretty damn well for most people. So we're just not going to do anything with it. So I guess I'm stuck with it. Okay. Well, all right. So Microsoft releases the Edge driver. In 2016, concurrent with Safari 10, Apple releases a driver for Safari that ships as part of the browser. This is all pretty cool stuff. And then Mozilla releases Gecko driver for Firefox, which is compliant with the spec, right? It's spec compliant. It relies on the W3C spec that you've heard so much about this morning and throughout the day and in workshops yesterday and so on. And this is a pretty big deal, right? And I know Simon mentioned it this morning, but the spec is a candidate recommendation, and one of the necessary steps to move from candidate recommendation on to recommendation is to have implementations of the spec, multiple implementations of the spec that are working. And Firefox's Gecko driver is the first. And right now, this very moment, in the back of my head, because I never do anything without having background processes running, I am working on a spec-compliant version of the IE driver. A beta version of it is already available out there on the product drop point if you want to take a look at it and see if it works for you, because it really ought to. But where we are today is vastly different from where we were when I first started on this project in terms of, wow, we have an implementation from Mozilla for Firefox. We have an implementation from Google for Chrome. We have an implementation from Microsoft for Edge. We have an implementation from Apple for Safari. That's really kind of amazing when you stop to think about it, that the browser vendors are actually helping us as an open source project to be able to automate the browser. That's really cool. And that kind of brings me to my third takeaway about being an effective change agent in creating software, is that the only way you really get lasting change is through collaboration. You can go pretty far by yourself, and we went pretty far as a software project on our own. But to be really effective and to really make lasting changes, it required collaboration between a whole bunch of organizations and individuals. So that pretty much brings us to today and kind of to the end of my particular story, at least for now. And I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've at least been mildly entertained. And the collaboration, participation, communication are just some of the things that are required to be an effective agent of change. Incidentally, this particular image as we come to kind of the end of our time together today, I chose it deliberately. The Constitutional Convention in 1787, when at the close of the Constitutional Convention, and the members were signing the Constitution, Benjamin Franklin was heard to observe, and James Madison recorded this. Benjamin Franklin was heard to observe to people near him. He pointed to the president's chair of the hall, where behind which a rising sun had been painted. And he said he observed to a few members near him that painters had found it difficult to distinguish in their art between a rising and a setting sun. And he was heard to say that, and I'm going to botch the quote, but he said pretty much, often and often throughout the proceedings, in the vicissitudes and deliberations, I have often wondered whether the image behind the president is a rising or a setting sun. And at length, I am glad to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun. It's been a great 25 years for me, and I still feel like we're at the very beginning of what we can do. And maybe in another 25 years, if I'm still around, good Lord willing, the creek don't rise, maybe you guys will invite me back to another Selenium conference, and I'll be able to listen maybe to one of you tell your story. Listen, y'all have been amazing in indulging me and giving me the time to speak to you. And for your attention, you've made Patty Evans' husband very, very happy. And for that, I thank you.